Good morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball, and it's an honor to be your MC on this Easter Sunday. Easter to us means we get to wear funny hats, celebrate the opening of baseball season, decorate some eggs, and possibly have some brunch. So it's going to be a great Sunday. We have one of our all-time favorite presenters today. It's going to be a festive Easter Sunday. Now, a reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Our reader this morning is our president, the lovely and talented Ann Henderson, who may or may not be joined by her dogs in the background this morning. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. I just had to unmute now because, of course, the dogs would like to chime in. Anyway, I'm doing a reading because it is the last day of International Women's Day. I'm doing a reading about that, or about somebody, a woman. In 1882, 18-year-old Elizabeth Cochrane was living in Pittsburgh when the local newspaper published an article about what girls are good for. Having babies and keeping house was the answer, according to the article. The article displeased Elizabeth enough so that she wrote an anonymous rebuttal, which in turn so impressed the paper's editor that he ran an ad asking the writer to identify herself. When Elizabeth contacted him, he hired her on the spot. It was customary at the time for female reporters to use pen names, so the editor gave her one that he took from a Stephen Foster song. It was the name under which she would become famous, Nellie Bly. Bly's passion was investigative reporting, but the newspaper usually assigned her to more feminine subjects, such as theater and fashion. After writing a controversial series of articles exposing the working conditions of female factory workers, and after again being relegated to reporting on society functions and women's hobbies, at age 21, Bly left for Mexico on a dangerous and unprecedented assignment. For a woman, of course, to report on the condition of the working class people there. After her reporting got her in trouble with the local authorities, she fled the country and later published her dispatches in a popular book. At age 23, having established a reputation as a daring and provocative reporter, Bly was hired by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and there she began the undercover project that made her famous. In order to investigate the condition, let me just back up here. She began the undercover project that made her famous. In order to investigate the conditions inside New York's women's lunatic asylum, Bly took on a fake identity, checked into a woman's boarding house, and faked insanity so convincingly that she soon found herself committed to the asylum. The report she published of her 10 days there was a sensation and led to important reforms in the treatment of the mentally ill. The following year, Bly undertook her most sensational assignment yet, a solo trip around the world inspired by Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. With only 2 days' notice, Bly set out on November 14th, 1889, and her purse tied around her neck. Pulitzer's competitor, the New York Cosmopolitan, immediately sent out one of its reporters, Elizabeth Bisland, to race Bly, traveling in the opposite direction. As Pulitzer had hoped, the stunt was a publicity bonanza, as readers eagerly followed news on Bly's journey, and the paper sponsoring a contest for readers to guess the exact time of Bly's return, with the correct guess winning an expense-paid trip to Europe. 72 days later, Bly made her triumphant return, four and a half days ahead of Bisland, having circumnavigated the globe, traveling alone almost the entire time. It was the fastest any human had ever made the journey. Nellie Bly was an international celebrity. At age 31, Bly married industrialist Robert Seaman, a 73-year-old millionaire, leaving behind her journalism career and her pen name. When her husband died in 1904, she ran the family business. She patented 2 inventions during her time as an industrialist. She changed the method of payment of workers from piecework to salary, and even provided recreational centers for them. Unfortunately, a few of the long-term employees were caught cheating the company, and a long legal battle ensued, and ending in bankruptcy and employees suing her. Impoverished, she began writing for the New York Evening Journal. In 1914, to avoid a warrant for obstructing justice, she fled to Austria, just as World War I was breaking out, and she returned to journalism, one of the first women reporters to work in an active war zone. Nellie Bly's remarkable life ended on January 27th, 1922, when she died of heart disease and pneumonia in New York at age 57. I think this is a remarkable woman, particularly considering that time. And I was like the fact that I would read that to you.
Thank you, Ann. A timely and educational reading. I really enjoyed that. I'm sure we have some fans in the audience of the political docuseries, The West Wing, and that was my first exposure to Nellie Bly. They had a nice reference to her on that show, but you gave us much more detail. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
It is fitting that our presenter this morning is coming to us on Easter Sunday. For if HGP had a Jesus figure, it would be Dr. Jeff Seward. He is presented to us over 30 times on topics ranging from economic structures, global political landscapes, to motivating individuals to create a better world. Today's topic: what is populism, and can it be used to reform democracy? Dr. Seward has a PhD in political science from Stanford, had a long distinguished career in public television, and he recently retired from a 30-year award-winning career as a professor at Pacific University. Let's have a rousing, hat-falling ovation from those at the Friendly House, and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Dr. Jeff Seward.
There will be a collection plate later. Well, I'd like to start today with a few reflections on Easter. This is the official culmination of Holy Week in most of the Western world, except in my Uruguay. Uruguay passed a law in 1919 that officially separated church and state 105 years ago. One of its provisions was that no official national holidays should be given religious names. So Holy Week in Uruguay is not called La Semana Santa. It is now, that is Holy Week, it is now officially known as La Semana de Turismo, Tourism Week. So happy Tourism Week, everybody. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we have a new Christian religious leader, one that should warm the heart of every dedicated atheist. At last, a man hawking a classic religious text who apparently has no idea what is in it. So meanwhile, here in the United States, we have a new Christian religious leader, one that should warm the heart of every dedicated atheist. At last, a man hawking a classic religious text who apparently has no idea of what is in it and whose whole life contradicts every ethical guideline contained in it. It's Donald Trump and his God Bless the USA Bible, also known as the King Donald version. Launched in the same week that his social media company, Truth Social, went public and made Trump $3 to $4 billion richer, even though it is almost certain to go completely bust, as it continues to show no profit and lose millions of dollars every quarter. If the MAGA millions embrace both of these initiatives while wearing Trump's golden sneakers, we will know that the Trump cult has finally reached its apogee. So since the Christian tradition seems to be engaged in self-parody this week, maybe we should turn to an alternative religious framework, Hinduism. In that spirit, let me offer up a song from that renowned Hindu theologian and country western music star Roger Miller. If I was a bird and you was a fish, what would we do? I guess we'd wish for reincarnation, reincarnation. Wouldn't it be a sensation to come back to like a reincarnation? I love you, don't you know, I always will. I'm a boy, you're a girl, but suppose you was a rose and I was a whippoorwill. If I was a tree and you was a flower, what would we do? We'd wait for the power of reincarnation, reincarnation. Wouldn't it be a sensation to come back to like a reincarnation? So enough about Easter. So enough about Easter and Tourism Week and Hinduism. What about populism? That's what I'm supposed to be talking about, right? The history of the term populism includes a wide range of movements. So many, in fact, that students and theorists of populism are in constant debates about which things that have been called populism can really fit in that category. In the US, we usually associate the term with the late 19th century movement of Western and Southern farmers mobilizing against the railroads and the Eastern bankers. But at the same time, in the late 19th century, there was a movement in Russia where idealistic students moved to peasant villages, even married into peasant families, with the idea that they were going to mobilize rural peasants for a revolution that would restore the socialism of medieval peasant communes. One of the husbands in Fiddler on the Roof is exactly this kind of revolutionary who's marrying the daughter and going off to live in some peasant village. They were called populists too, although their movement never really mobilized very much. Was Mussolini's fascism an extreme form of populism? What did that have in common with American populism or Russian populism? If we include Mussolini, is that just fascism on steroids or a completely different phenomenon? Does it make any sense to shoehorn it into the concept of populism? How about Huey Long, Joseph McCarthy, George Wallace, Marine Le Pen in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Juan Perón and Evita in Argentina? Don't we need 3 or 4 or 6 categories for all this stuff? If not, what does all this have in common? Do we get any deeper understanding of what's going on in all of this if we dump it into one category, or that category becomes so amorphous as to lose all coherent meaning? Well, I am in the camp of saying there is a common thread to all of this, even if each of these movements has its own unique characteristics as well. I also think it makes sense to make a pretty big distinction between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And I think it's an interesting question to ask whether some forms of populism can actually be a constructive force for rejuvenating democratic institutions, or whether all of them have a kind of proto-fascist, anti-democratic quality. So if all these diverse things belong in the same category, as I think they sort of do, what are the essential features of that category? Well, I think they all tend to share 6 basic characteristics. First, they all insist that existing social, economic, and political institutions are fundamentally corrupt, essentially rigged to benefit wealthy and powerful elites and screw ordinary people, and therefore deserve no respect, and in fact deserve to be disrupted, even blown up, and replaced with something better. 2, they all work outside normal political channels, although they sometimes work inside them as well, outside of conventional political campaigns or interest group lobbying, to mobilize non-elite segments of the population to demand that they get respect and power through non-conventional means, including mob violence if necessary. 3, they all claim to represent the folk or the people or the real Americans, and paint the elites that they are struggling against as enemies of the people, as not really counting as authentic Americans or Germans or Italians or Argentines or whatever. So they are inherently polarizing as they refuse to acknowledge their opponents as being legitimate citizens or legitimate political actors. No, their opponents are evil traitors engaged in constant conspiracies to suppress or exploit the true people. That's why they're called populists, because they have this emphasis on the people, who invariably doesn't include all the people of the society. 4, because they don't trust any major existing institutions, they tend to elevate the movement above institutions, and closely associated with this, tend to elevate a charismatic leader who embodies the true interests of the true people. I always think of a line that Hitler's top lieutenant at the time, Rudolf Hess, shouted in a speech at one of Hitler's famous Nuremberg rallies. Deutschland ist Hitler und Hitler ist Deutschland. Germany is Hitler and Hitler is Germany. You can kind of imagine substituting Donald Trump into that litany. You can't trust the state. You can't trust political parties. You can't trust parliaments or congresses. You can't trust corporations. You can't trust courts. You can't trust the press. You can't trust expert authority. But you can trust completely the hero leader who is fighting the evil empire of the enemies of the people and who is always on your side. All criticism of the movement and all criticism of the great leader are all simply confirmation that the enemies of the people are out to get you and get the leader because they want to hang on to their privileges and their power. 5, if ever in power, they treat all opposition as illegitimate and tend to persecute because they're representatives of the enemies of the people, right? Who have now been overcome, and tend to persecute their opponents in legal and non-legal ways, including intimidation from mob violence. They also set about to cripple any institution that tries to limit the power of the great leader or the small clique of leaders who head the movement. So the leader is the embodiment of the popular will. All constraints on him are part of the conspiracy to keep the real people in submission. So all checks and balances are inherently anti-democratic because democracy is embodied in the ability of the leader to do what people want. So the leader goes after the independent press, the independent judiciary, elected legislatures that oppose them, opposition political parties, and also even persecutes large businesses that don't fall loyally in line with the movement. And his supporters cheer every time he smacks these institutions down, and they squeal with delight every time the elite victims claim they are being demonized or treated unfairly. Boo-hoo! The rich and powerful are finally getting what's coming to them, and now they're whining. Oh, boo-hoo! How does it feel to get the raw end of the deal like we've been getting for generations? How does it feel to get a taste of your own medicine? Whack 'em again, oh great leader. This makes them more or less immune to external facts, criticism, reality, because any external criticism confirms their understanding that there's a conspiracy out to get people like them. And 6th, once mobilized, and especially if they have tasted even a short time in power, they tend to persist for a long time, sometimes for generations, and in that way keep the society in which they spring up deeply polarized indefinitely. Juan Perón first came to power in Argentina almost 80 years ago. But he returned to power 18 years after his first government was deposed by a military coup. He'd been in exile all that time. He died almost 50 years ago, but Argentina is still deeply divided between Peronists and anti-Peronists. Currently have an anti-Peronist government that just took over from a Peronist government. I would predict that once the Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro government falls in Venezuela, Venezuela will remain similarly polarized between Chavistas and anti-Chavistas for a long time to come. And I believe even if Trump is decisively defeated this November, and even after he dies, Trumpism is going to survive in the United States and keep us deeply polarized for a long time to come. So those are the things that I think all forms of populism share. But in a broad sense, I would distinguish between two very different forms of populism, although they sometimes bleed into each other. There's left-wing populism and right-wing populism. I'm going to put Juan Perón in the left-wing populism category, even though he was a Nazi and Mussolini sympathizer. But his policies were devoted to incorporating the Argentine working class and providing lots of material benefits to the excluded. So that's why I say it sometimes bleed one into the other, left-wing populism or right-wing populism. So let's look at examples of left-wing populism in the United States. I would start with Samuel Adams in Boston in the run-up to the American Revolution. I've just finished a biography of Samuel Adams, who I didn't know much about. Fascinating character. In the run-up to the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, Adams was just indefatigable in mobilizing ordinary Bostonians, especially lower-class artisans, blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, shopkeepers, saloon keepers, etc., to push back against English taxes and English authority. Most of the respectable, rich, and powerful elites of Massachusetts were on the other side, working closely with British authorities. Adams wrote polemics against this upper crust unceasingly. And although his writing always seems very lucid and logical, it is also very demagogic. He simplifies, he exaggerates, and if necessary, just makes stuff up to mobilize people against the ruling elites of Boston. And he doesn't stop at writing. He also stirs up violent mobs who harass and threaten both British and American officials, governors, lieutenant governors, judges, customs agents, tax collectors, or rich merchants who refuse to boycott British goods. He is one of the shadowy figures behind the Boston Tea Party. We still don't know who the people who actually were the Boston Tea Party or who exactly put it together. But he also mobilizes mobs that attack public offices and even private homes. In one notorious instance, a mob he has fired up invades the private home of the lieutenant governor, an American colonist named Thomas Hutchinson, and completely destroys or carries off everything inside, so the home is just a battered and empty shell when they are through. He systematically used the threat of violence to terrorize officials and organize resistance. He mobilized those he defines as the patriot people and demonizes everyone who is collaborating with British authority, mainly powerful and wealthy elite American colonists. But his tactics are successful in creating an atmosphere in Boston that drifts increasingly toward the idea of not just resistance to British authority, but complete independence. In many ways, he's kind of the father of the American Revolution, but his tactics and his ideology in many ways are essentially populist according to those criteria that I mentioned. Another major figure that I think qualifies as a populist is Andrew Jackson, who mobilizes urban workers and Western farmers against the Eastern Whig elites, and especially banks. When he is inaugurated in 1829, he holds an open house reception at the White House, which turns into a virtual riot as his motley crowd of supporters, hundreds, even thousands of lower class followers, most of them drunk, swarm through the presidential mansion in their muddy boots, breaking glassware and china and leaving the place a complete mess. Horrifying all the respectable people in Washington and the country. For the next decade or so, American society is deeply polarized between Jacksonian politics with its lower class base and Whig politics, the precursors of the Republican Party, rooted in more respectable segments of wealthy and powerful elites. But this populism of Jackson results in a huge expansion of the American electorate as lower class white men get the vote for the first time. He's a racist. He's guilty of genocidal actions toward Native Americans. He's a slave owner himself, but he opens up the American political system to the working class through his more or less populist activities. Then, of course, there is the populist movement of Southern and Western farmers in the last decade of the 19th century, who mobilized to attack the railroads and Eastern bankers who are systematically exploiting rural farmers. They managed to more or less capture, eventually, they have a party of their own, the People's Party. They managed to more or less capture, though, the Democratic Party of the time, which nominates William Jennings Bryan as their presidential candidate 3 times in a row. He loses every time, but he's got an interesting career. He's later Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson and resigns when Wilson goes to war because he's a pacifist. And then, of course, he's the prosecuting attorney in the famous Scopes monkey trial, in which he rails against evolution. When he's a presidential candidate, he's of course famous for his Cross of Gold speech, in which he rants against the tight money policy associated with the gold standard, shouting, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He never gets elected president, although the populist People's Party does manage to elect mayors and governors and legislatures in several southern and western states. Some southern populists drift into racist attacks on Black people, following figures like Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who was governor of South Carolina and later a US senator and an ardent segregationist. He got his nickname by threatening to use a pitchfork to prod that bag of beef, President Grover Cleveland. But most of the populist movement supported a pretty progressive platform of economic and political reform. In many ways, they laid the political groundwork for later progressive era reforms like a national income tax, direct election of senators, anti-monopoly laws and policies, and political reforms like the initiative, the recall, and the party primary. Then there was Huey Long in the 1930s, who rode to power in Louisiana by mobilizing what he referred to as the Hicks against the big oil companies and other powerful elites in Louisiana of the late 20s and 30s. As governor and later senator, he became the virtual dictator of Louisiana, and his regime became famously corrupt and authoritarian and violent towards his opponents. But he also became a major public figure nationally, organizing hundreds of Share the Wealth clubs all across America with the slogan, "Every man a king." Franklin Roosevelt saw him as a serious potential threat to run for president in 1936, but he was assassinated on the steps of the Louisiana State Capitol building before he was able to mount his presidential campaign. But he did manage to extract major concessions from the oil companies, and he built a ton of rural roads, hospitals, and schools all across the state that primarily benefited poor people, and built Louisiana State University into a leading Southern institution of higher learning. He was thoroughly despised by much of the Louisiana elite, one of whom assassinated him, and created a deeply polarized society in the state as his machine carried on with relatives of his being major state and national political figures on up to about 1970. His son, Russell Long, was a major figure in the United States Senate from 1948 to 1969 and the leader of the Long machine back in Louisiana. With all of these examples, there's a dark side to populist episodes in US history. But there is also the historical fact that all of these more or less left-wing versions of populism led to reforms that made the American political system more democratic and more supportive of economic and social equality. But of course, there are also examples of right-wing populism in US history. The Southern populists became leading advocates of racial segregation in the South. Joseph McCarthy mobilized attacks on liberal elites in Washington that created the big Red Scares of the 1950s and 1960s. George Wallace, famous for his staunch support of Southern segregation, remember his rallying cry, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He lost that battle, but then turned himself into a national presidential candidate, mobilizing small town and working class resentments into a campaign that won several states in the 1968 presidential election as an independent, and then won a number of Democratic primaries in 1972, and was a significant force in the 1972 Democratic Convention that ended up nominating George McGovern for president. One of his more important consequences was showing Richard Nixon and the Republican Party that they could build a strong Republican presence in the South and in portions of the working class with a Southern strategy that transferred the racist Southern vote from the Democrats to the Republicans. And it created a Republican-dominated South to this day. I am a Latin Americanist by trade. I'm especially familiar with famous populist movements in Latin America. There, most of the major examples are left-wing. The classic case is Juan Perón and Evita. Juan Perón was a military man. He came to prominence as part of a military dictatorship during World War II. Argentina was neutral during World War II until the last year. He was the vice president and the secretary of the Minister of Labor. And as Minister of Labor, he consistently sided with workers against companies in strikes and tried to shuffle social benefits to the working class as well. Became immensely popular. The military regime itself became deeply suspicious of his ambitions and arrested him. Whereupon the workers loyal to him and his future wife, Evita, mobilized like 1 million people to march on Buenos Aires on October 17th, 1945, I believe it was, demanding that he be released. The military government, terrified, did release him, and then he proceeded to run for president, got elected in 1946 and reelected in 1950. What did he do as president? Well, Argentina had built up a huge reserve of foreign currency, of dollars and gold and so forth during World War II, shipping beef, leather, wheat to whoever would buy them on all sides of the Second World War. And so they had this huge pot of money that they couldn't use to buy anything during the war because they couldn't import anything because of the disruption of world trade. He essentially spent that money over his first term in moving the share of gross national product gained by the working class from about 25% of GDP to 40% of GDP. Massive shift of income distribution in Argentina, plus lots of social programs. He also, in a populist way, mobilized the Argentine people against the oligarchs who were keeping the working class down but also against the oligarchs who were collaborating with foreign capitalists, mostly British capitalists in this case, to dominate big sections of the Argentine economy. And so he expropriated most of these British companies that controlled banks and railroads and shipping and other kinds of things. So he mobilized the true Argentine people against the oligarchs and against the foreign exploiters. As his government went on, he also became increasingly authoritarian, organized gangs of thugs to intimidate opponents, shut down the free press more or less, took over the schools and had them indoctrinate people in his justicialist ideology. And he was eventually overthrown in a coup in 1955. But as I said before, his legacy went on. He destroyed the old Communist Party, basically, and the communist-oriented trade unions, and created Peronist trade unions. The number of people in unions between 1945 and 1951 went from about 500,000 union members to 2.5 million union members. And that Peronist labor federation is still a potent force in Argentine politics to this day. And so his legacy is a very mixed one. Oh, the other thing is Evita became her own one-person welfare program. She extorted basically contributions from the oligarchs and little contributions from people to build up a huge fund for her institute, which she then used to just distribute goodies to people. She would hold court in this building in Buenos Aires, and hundreds of people would come every day, tell her their sob stories, and she would pay for their doctor's bills or their back rent or whatever it was that they needed. And she handed out millions of dollars this way. Nobody ever knew exactly where all the money came from or where it all went, because she didn't keep any public records. Insisted that she didn't have time. She was too busy helping people to account for the money that was passing through her hands. So it was a source of enormous corruption, but also a real source of sort of welfare benefits to whoever sort of showed up every day to get her largesse. A very interesting character. Another left-wing populist, sort of left-wing populist, was Getulio Vargas in Brazil. Early in his government, he came to power in a kind of revolution in 1930 that knocked down an old oligarchic political system in Brazil. And in the beginning, he was allied with a Brazilian fascist party, the Integralistas. But he broke with them because they tried to overthrow him in a coup. And then he put down a communist revolt as well when they tried to start a revolution. And then he sort of played off Nazi Germany and the United States to see which one was going to give him more goodies to decide whose side he was going to be on. He notoriously made them bid over who was going to build the first Brazilian steel plant. And eventually the United States won that competition. We built the first modern steel plant in Brazil that became the foundation for what is now a very competitive Brazilian steel industry that's kicking the hell out of the United States steel industry. And eventually he decided to stop playing footsie with the Nazis and join the United States, and actually sent troops to Europe to fight alongside the Americans in World War II. After the war, he was deposed by the military, who thought it wasn't that cool to have a sometimes proto-Nazi in power after the defeat of the Nazis. He went into sort of resentful retirement, then came back and ran for president in 1950 and won big. and was president for 4 years. His government was pretty corrupt, but it was very friendly towards the working class, sided with workers in labor disputes and shuffled a lot of social benefits to them, created a national oil company, Petrobras, which is one of the leading oil companies in the world to this day, created a national electrical company called Electrobras. He was about to be overthrown by the military again because of corruption and because his bodyguard had killed the Air Force bodyguard of an opposition politician and so forth. And to forestall the coup, he committed suicide in the presidential palace and left behind a manifesto in which he compared himself to Jesus and told the downtrodden Brazilians that whenever they were suffering, he would be at their side. And the oligarchs had forestalled the coup. The coup didn't happen until 10 years later. But his political perspective lasted up into the 1990s. I lived in Brazil in the 1980s, and the governor of Rio was a populist who was in the Vargas tradition, and very charismatic and greatly supported by poor people in Rio, which also meant greatly supported by Black people in Rio, and made promises like in Rio, the slums are up on mountaintops. The rich people all live down by the beaches, right? Behind them are these sort of hills that go way up, and they're full of favelas, that is spontaneous slums. And it's hard. And then people come down and work as maids and cooks and waiters and things in the rich people area. One of his promises, then they got to trudge all the way back up this hillside. At one point, he promised to build escalators up all the mountains to the favelas. He never did that, but he did contract a famous communist architect who was the main architect behind the modernistic capital of Brasilia to design cement schools that were sort of prefab construction. So he had a factory that was churning out prefab, pretty slick looking schools for ordinary people. And he built like 50 or 60 of these around the city of Rio de Janeiro. Unfortunately, he didn't bother to populate them, most of them with teachers and support. So some of them worked very well, but a lot of them just sort of sat empty as white elephants. But it was another example of where the political legacy of Getulio Vargas lived on really until this guy died. He was a presidential candidate, a vice presidential candidate. He was governor of 2 different states in his career. A very flamboyant, very smart, very talented politician who mobilized poor people against the elites. In some ways, maybe the most successful populist in Latin America, and some people wouldn't categorize him that way, but I would, was Lázaro Cárdenas of Mexico. He was the 4th or 5th president in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution. He was the one who really organized the party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, very weird, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, kind of an oxymoron. So that dominated Mexican politics for 50 years. In what way was he a populist? Well, he spent lots of time mobilizing the poor and mobilizing the working class and mobilizing peasants. In his case, he organized them. He organized labor unions for the workers. He organized peasant organizations for peasants. He organized the PRI. And he was just seen as the sort of father of the poor, and spent lots of time traveling around the countryside, meeting with poor people in the presidential palace. He also got into a big conflict with the American oil companies. Didn't start out that way, but the government ruled in favor of the workers in a labor dispute, and then the oil companies refused to recognize the authority of the government judgment. And so he nationalized them. And that was the basis for the big publicly owned oil company in Mexico today. Pemex is their national oil company, because he nationalized the foreign oil companies back in. So he mobilized peasants in addition to organizing peasants. He also carried out the biggest land reform in Latin America until Castro. 1930s. And his land reform, instead of giving land to individual peasants, tried to reconstitute the peasant ejidos, which was a communal village ownership of the land that had been traditional before, up until the late 19th century. And he realized that one of the problems they were going to have was financing. So he also created a bunch of ejido banks solely for the purpose of financing these peasant ejidos. Now, later on, they fell apart and landholding got reconcentrated in Mexico. But for a long time, this was really a proto-revolutionary reform of the countryside. So he was a very progressive character. However, this organization of the working class and organization of the peasantry was folded into the organization of the PRI, which became essentially an authoritarian one-party dominant system. There were opposition parties, but they were insignificant. And so Mexico was essentially an authoritarian place up into the 1970s, but it was also a highly effective place. There was a Mexican miracle that created like 6% annual growth for about 30, 40 years, from about 1940 up until the global debt crisis erupted. And so there was tremendous upward mobility in Mexico. A lot of people lifted out of poverty and so forth. So here again, they were examples of left-wing populism that managed to accomplish major social and economic reforms and be inclusionary in bringing formerly marginalized and excluded people into the mainstream of society, and thereby gained tremendous loyalty from those groups, but also implemented essentially authoritarian political systems, and systems that were both corrupt and repressive towards opponents. And of course, there's Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who said he was creating 21st century socialism, but what it looked like to me was 20th century populism, with the great leader mobilizing again the poor and providing them with benefits that they'd been excluded from, creating a healthcare system for the poor, fighting the oligarchs, and trying to undermine the traditional political institutions of Venezuela semi-successfully. I mean, one of the things he did was he created participatory democracy councils at the local level, but he didn't abolish the elected authorities at the local level. So there was this tremendous confusion of who's in charge, you know, the legally constituted authorities or these newly created participatory councils. And some of them worked fairly well, but a lot of them turned into patronage things where only Chavez's supporters were allowed to control these local participatory institutions. And they were in charge of handing out social benefits, assigning housing. And if you weren't a loyal Chavista, you didn't get them, right? So they became a real perversion of the participatory principle. And of course, as the Chavez regime went on, and as even worse under Nicolas Maduro, became completely intolerant of opposition and has evolved into a basically corrupt dictatorship. And millions of Venezuelans have fled Venezuela because of the terrible, they also destroyed the economy, have fled because of the terrible state of the Venezuelan economy and opposition to this regime. Every country in South America is trying to cope with this flood of Venezuelan refugees who have made their way to the country. And it's a big problem in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador, in Chile, and Brazil. So much for left-wing populism, where you see it accomplishing lots of things, but also entailing a pretty important dark side, especially in the direction of authoritarianism. How about right-wing populism? Well, we've had that here as well. I went through McCarthy and Trump, of course. There's also been right-wing populism outside the US. There was a guy named Poujade in France. Anybody ever heard of Poujade or Poujadism? It was kind of like these farmers who've been demonstrating in France recently and driving their tractors and blocking roads and so forth. He was doing this in the 50s in protest against neglect of agriculture and in support of against giving independence to Algeria and so forth. And it grew into a whole movement. And he eventually sort of drifted off into racist, neo-fascist kinds of politics. Marine Le Pen, her father was an anti-Semite, Holocaust denier, proto-fascist, nostalgic for the old Vichy pro-Nazi regime from World War II. She eventually kicked him out of the party and took over the party, but has maintained this kind of populist, mobilizing people full of resentments. She's displaced in many places. The old vote of the Communist Party has gone to her party, which she has now renamed. So it doesn't even have the name that it used to have under her father. And she tried to incorporate some left-wing aspects into her movement now. So she's been advocating for improved pensions and improved unemployment insurance and so forth, and opposing taxes like gasoline taxes and so forth that hit the poor. But she's an example. And of course, the great example of European populism is fascism and Nazism. I include them as the extreme right-wing end of the populist spectrum because they shared all those characteristics. They mobilized against powerful and wealthy elites. That's why Hitler's movement is called National Socialism, is he adopted a lot of socialistic rhetoric against the rich and wealthy. What he tended to do was to take Marxist criticism of capitalism and turn it into a critique of Jews as the emblem of bad capitalism. I mean, there was good capitalism of good old Germans like Krupp and the big chemical, IG Farben and so forth. And then there was the dirty capitalists, the Jews, with the department stores and this, that, and the other thing. So he demonized Jews and he demonized Marxists. So when he came to power, Jews were not actually the first targets of Nazi repression. The first targets were the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, which he systematically dismantled, threw all their leaders in jail. And there was discrimination and street violence against Jews, but the real campaigns against Jews came a little bit later. The Nuremberg laws, for example, that outlawed mixed marriages and various other things didn't happen till 2 years after Hitler had come to power. And of course, the Holocaust doesn't really get underway seriously till the beginnings of World War II. And so there were the German people, and then there were the un-German people, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Marxists. None of those people were real Germans. The real Germans were the Aryan race. And so Hitler's movement didn't just sort of tend towards racism. Racism was at the core of its ideology. This was less true of Mussolini. Mussolini did not really engage in vigorous anti-Semitic policies until late in the 30s, when he sort of caved to Hitler's demands that he do that. During World War II in France, actually, the Italian part of occupied France was kind of a haven for Jews for a while, who fled there to escape the death camps. And of course, we have Viktor Orban, who has again mobilized Hungarians, true Hungarians, against Jews, against George Soros especially, who he essentially kicked out of Hungary, although he's a Hungarian, had done all kinds of work creating universities and things in Hungary. And his big appeal is against immigrants, against immigration. So Hungary has shut itself off from refugees coming from Syria or Afghanistan or elsewhere, in really quite Islamophobe and racist sorts of ways. And Orban has been extremely clever at gradually, systematically undermining the independence of every institution that could potentially check his power. He essentially bought up most of the opposition press, or had his business cronies buy up the opposition press and turn them into pro-Orban organs. He has politicized the judiciary by injecting his favorites there. He's just gone through systematically every institution that could put a check on his power, and gradually but systematically undermined all of them, and has created in the process a deeply polarized Hungarian society in which a majority seem to support Orban. He wins elections pretty convincingly, although they're pretty rigged elections as well, because the opposition isn't given much real opportunity to compete. In Latin America, the most obvious example of right-wing populism is the tropical Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, who basically copied Trump. He's a retired military officer who's nostalgic for the military regime in Brazil, and as among other things said that the military regime didn't torture enough people, didn't kill enough people, and they should have been more repressive towards their opponents. Yeah, I don't know, they just were weak, you know. But he, you know, he talks about the fake news, and the press is the enemies of the people. And so he is mobilized, and there's a kind of a pseudo-nationalism to his policies. And he rode these resentments into power. And when he lost the election, he mobilized supporters for an attack on the Capitol, just like Trump. It was like a year later. Unlike the United States, though, the Brazilian government immediately arrested all those people on the spot, or as many of them as they could catch, and has been systematically prosecuting them, and has banned Bolsonaro from public office for the next 10 years, and is prosecuting a number of his cronies, and is sort of moving in on prosecuting Bolsonaro for various crimes against the state. Their justice system has been much more agile and aggressive about going after the violent coup attempt that Bolsonaro organized compared to what we've done here in the United States. So populism can take various forms. In the right-wing form, it tends to degenerate into racism, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and kind of aggressive retrograde nationalism of various kinds. So what about Trump? Here we have Trump. You know, he fits all of these characteristics. I hope as I went through those 6 characteristics of populism, you say, oh yeah, that's Trump. Oh, that's Trump. Oh yeah, that's Trump. Oh yeah, that's Trump. What are the causes of Trump, of Trumpian populism? I think there are 3 main things that people are reacting to, and they find in him someone who they think will fight back against these trends that are, to their minds, ruining their lives. First one, these are in no particular order. I'm not saying this is the most important one. The first one is cultural change. This includes affirmative action, homosexual rights, trans rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to try and diminish racism in the country, sexual liberty in general, this feeling that their way of life is under attack by these new social trends that they find repulsive or even satanic. And so, especially small towns and rural areas where these kinds of cultural changes have not occurred much spontaneously, but seem to small town and rural folk to be things that elites are imposing on them, is one source of real resentment. And closely associated with this is a resentment that because they're resisting these things, highbrow educated elites are looking down upon them condescendingly and telling them that they're evil people, that they're racists and homophobes, which they are. But they don't appreciate being labeled as evil people and getting into institutions like universities or companies that demand that they change their attitudes or be labeled evil people. Well, no labels is a different thing. That is neither Republican or Democrat. So cultural change, I think, is one big thing. Second is demographic change. And this has a couple of dimensions. One is that is immigration and illegal immigration especially, but immigration in general. People don't like to go to the grocery store and find that everybody's speaking Spanish or Arabic or something. And also the rise of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States into prominent positions in mainstream organizations. So challenges to white privilege, in effect, so that it's now the case that public opinion polls show that a majority of white Americans believe that whites are more discriminated against than Black people are. Because suddenly in mainstream organizations, they're finding themselves in competition with Black people, in competition with Latino people that didn't used to exist. They didn't used to have to compete with those people because those people weren't allowed in those institutions, or at least weren't allowed at professional levels. And even though, if you look at any major institution in America, Blacks and Latinos are still underrepresented, there's this feeling among many white Americans that, oh, you can't get a good job anymore because they give everything to the Blacks or they give everything to Latinos. So demographic change. And the third thing is, I think, the negative impact of globalization and economic modernization on small towns and rural areas. Globalization has benefited the global economy in many ways. It's made the world a lot richer place, but it's gutted a lot of small towns and rural areas that have lost their local factory and with things like Walmart and the big box stores have lost their local commerce too, have lost the neighborhood grocery store, have lost the neighborhood hardware store. And so all of those things come together. And it is made for a powerful movement of resentment and a capture of one of the two major political parties, the Republicans, in some ways like the way the populists captured the Democratic Party under William Jennings Bryan. It's a deeply polarizing movement, demagogic, charismatic leadership, division of the population into real Americans and enemies of the people, and a willingness to use violence and threats of violence as a standard tactic. And if Trump comes back to power, he will carry out a systematic attack on institutions and all forms of checks and balances on his power. The press, the judiciary, the federal civil service, the Department of Justice, etc. And whether elected or not, I think he's likely to generate a deeply polarized society for a long time to come. So in conclusion, I would say populism as a movement can challenge and disrupt elite dominance, ossified political institutions, and inequality, and therefore become a spur to progressive reform. But populism in power leads to the erosion of beneficial institutions, erosion of checks and balances, erosion of balanced and constructive economic policy, erosion of social coherence, and causes social polarization lasting for a generation or more. And in its right-wing form, constantly flirts with dangerous elements of fascism. Let me just leave you with a final quote from a guy I don't know named Johann Hakelius. He's talking about call-in shows, but if you just put in populism where he says call-in shows, which I'm going to do, I think this is an interesting quote. So the problem with populism, or call-in shows, is quite simple if you only dare to admit it. Democracy is best when not everyone can be heard all the time. If we are constantly reminded of all the stupid things that people say and think, it becomes rather difficult to remember good and noble arguments for everyone to be able to participate and decide.
Thank you so much, Jeff. A thorough and entertaining presentation. I know we have a lot of questions. I'll actually start with the first one. And that is, I'm trying to give us some hope for the future here. In terms of Trump populism, it does seem like it's going to exist for a while, but what is an international historical example where it looked like right-wing populism was going to last for a long time and maybe didn't last as long as people thought?
Well, I think the most obvious example is Nazi Germany, but it took the complete destruction of Germany and a catastrophic loss of World War II for that to collapse. But amazingly, even as the war was going terribly wrong, Germans fought vigorously and courageously right to the end of the war. Hitler mobilized kids under 15 years old and old people over 60 in the defense of Berlin, and they went out and died by the thousands in defense of Hitler. So his hold over the population, although it also included terrorism, where the SS was going around and shooting people who were deserters or who criticized the war effort. It's amazing how well his support held up until the final catastrophe. And even so, in Germany today, there's the Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing movement that's sort of a neo-Nazi movement that is nostalgic for the Nazi era, although they can't say that too much out loud because it's illegal in Germany to be too out loud about your affection for Hitler. So they can't use Nazi symbols and things. But I think that's the best example. As I say, in Latin America, Peronism lasted forever. And the movement of Getulio Vargas is still ongoing to some extent, but certainly lasted up into the 80s. William Jennings Bryan got nominated 3 times for president. I can imagine, even though he's very old, if he doesn't die, if Trump gets beat this time, I can imagine him being the Republican nominee again in 2028 and making another run at it. It's hard to see who his successors are if he dies, which presumably he will someday. I don't think Don Jr. is a very charismatic character, but you may not need a charismatic character. Peronism outlived the death of Perón and the death of Evita up to the present day. So I would expect the MAGA movement to be a permanent feature of American politics for the rest of our lifetimes, looking at the age of my audience here and myself. I don't expect to see the end of MAGAism. It's one reason I'm moving to Uruguay.
We have 3 questions from the friendly house. Let's take question number 1 at the mic.
You don't think His Majesty will rise from the tomb? That wasn't
No,
my question.
no.
My question is, when I went to Chile, and it's been what, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I was surprised at how much interest there still was. In fact, how half the population was still arguing that Pinochet had been a great leader and they had split families. We went to visit the brother of one of my hosts, and they were Pinochet supporters and non-Pinochet supporters. After having even visited the death camps, I was taken with how half the population still supported Pinochet. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, but I was interested that you didn't mention that.
Well, I wouldn't call Pinochet a populist exactly, although he did develop a very personalistic form of dictatorship eventually. I visited Chile a few years ago and had that same reaction. It kind of surprised me how many people were still nostalgic for Pinochet, and the conservative parties that have won a couple of elections there have included people who were ministers in Pinochet governments or close supporters, and they haven't tried to impose repressive authoritarian policies, but they have tried to model themselves on Pinochet's economic policies, which had their good and their bad components. But yeah, it's amazing, after all the revelations about how horrible the military government was there, there's still this nostalgia for Pinochet. In all the European cities, and Latin America is true, there's usually a big market somewhere in the center of town. You can go buy fresh produce and meat and fish and sausages and all of that. And they have little restaurants, you know, all scattered through them. And one of them in Santiago is a Pinochet restaurant that's got his name and is a place where he used to like to go eat, and it's still got his name and pictures of Pinochet on the wall and things. So Latin America has a history of dictators, populist and otherwise, being thrown out of power and then coming back to power 10 or 15 years later. Perón did, Getulio Vargas did. I think there's a Chilean president who did that. So movements that have deep roots don't disappear overnight.
It looks like our second questioner has made their way to the mic. Go ahead.
Yes, Jeff, you didn't mention very much the educational system or even the corporate system that much, but doesn't the educational system create all these elites that people always want to be overturning? And when you overturn one elite, don't you always get another one? And doesn't the educational system always find a way to make an elite? Is there some way we can change that to get rid of all this perpetual populist discontent?
I think, as I mentioned last time, all but one of the Supreme Court justices are graduates of Harvard and Yale Law School. And until recently, all of them were, until Amy Coney Barrett got now. One of the things that's happening, I think elite education, this may not be the right word, but elite education is slightly democratizing in that the Ivy League doesn't have enough slots for all the people who want education. and they're only admitting like 4 or 5% of their applicants. And so second-tier institutions are becoming elite institutions, more elite than they were. Duke, Notre Dame, University of Southern California, University of Chicago has always been pretty elite. But there's this whole that now these institutions are only admitting, 8 or 10% of their applicants. So the size of the population that's getting an elite education is growing. That's a very democratic trend. But I don't know that you can do much about that. I mean, these places are prestigious, and they're prestigious in part because they're so highly selective. And so just getting admitted to them appears to show something about your talents and abilities. And the graduates of those institutions get internships with Supreme Court justices and fancy jobs on Wall Street. And it's kind of self-perpetuating. And I think this is more true than it used to be. Upper middle class families are spending a lot of resources ensuring that their kids get into elite institutions, much more than they used to. And so if you're from a lower middle class or a poor family, you can't afford to provide for your children the things they're going to need to bust into Harvard or Yale or Brown or Columbia or Duke or University of Chicago or Notre Dame. So while a lot of these institutions are trying to do kind of affirmative action for people from non-elite families, in many ways, it's becoming harder and harder for non-elite families to get their kids into elite educational institutions. As far as the education goes, I think there are hundreds of colleges and universities that you can send your kids to where they get as good an education as they will get in the Ivy League. In some ways, Ivy League educations are pretty poor. They're great for the social networks that you establish, but a lot of the classes are taught by very famous professors in classes with 300 students in them, where you have no access to the professor. The professor gets up and gives a lecture, answers a few questions, and then retreats to his office, and his office is guarded by an army of graduate teaching assistants who intercept students who want help from ever reaching the famous professor. So I'm not impressed with the kind of education that people get at Ivy League institutions. I think really talented students got a better education at Pacific University while I was there than they would have gotten if they'd gotten into an Ivy League institution.
I had a quick follow-up to Al's question, kind of a difference in perspective. Couldn't you argue that our education system, with No Child Left Behind being around for 25 years, has kind of gotten away from critical thinking and led to a rise of right-wing populism?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that the public school system of the United States 30 or 40 years ago was a epicenter of critical thinking. So I'm not sure that there's that much of a decline. I think one of the things actually that has happened in public schools, and is one of the reasons that they're so controversial, is that although it's limited, there is a lot more attention to the underside of American history and American society. There's more attention paid to gender minorities, to racial minorities, to women's history, and the like. None of that was happening when I was in high school in the 1960s. I think the No Child Left Behind is a great slogan and a terrible program. I think it's led to this testification of American education, which stands in the way of real education. So everybody's teaching to the test. My daughter went to St. Mary's Academy, which is a wonderful place. It's an all-girls Catholic school, but half the students are not Catholics. but she hated history, and she took advanced placement U.S. history. I thought, this is great. Now she's going to get a real history course, and she's going to find this really fascinating. But the advanced placement U.S. history course was nothing but a daily cram session for the advanced placement exam. And it didn't do anything about looking critically at sources or examining different interpretations of history, or understanding how the past is another country. That's interesting to explore. I think she came out hating history even more after taking the advanced placement history course. I was just appalled at what it was and the experience that she went through. So I think that the testification of education is really bad, and it's also led to a complete de-emphasis of anything that's not tested. So art, music, and things like that are now seen as worthless, and so they're being cut, and teachers in those areas are either being let go or not going into the profession in the first place. And the teaching profession has become a misery. Between the impact of COVID, behavioral problems in the schools, the testification of the curriculum, low pay, being a teacher in the public schools is a misery today. I did it. And so people don't want to go into education programs to become teachers. The education program Pacific is really suffering because they can't get students who want to become teachers, let alone the best students.
We've got a line of questions at the friendly house. Let's go to questioner number 3 at the mic.
Thank you, Jeff. Great presentation. I wonder if you might say a few things about Mao and China.
Well, the communist countries are interesting because the communist movement started out, they share some things with populism. That is, they demonize elites, they demonize the capitalist class, and so forth. But they weren't supposed to coalesce around charismatic leaders. They're supposed to be collective things. The party was supposed to be the vanguard leader of the working class, and there was an effort to bring workers into the communist parties and to proletarianize intellectuals so that workers would become intellectuals and intellectuals would become workers, and there would be a whole elite that would lead the transition to a society without elites. But in country after a country, you got the emergence of charismatic, or in some case, just bureaucratically talented leaders who imposed one-man dictatorships. And so you get Stalin and Mao and Kim Il, what's the original? Kim Il-sung, is that right? Or am I confusing it with Star Trek? Fidel Castro. So Castro's Cuba, in some ways, has a lot of populist features. Tito in Yugoslavia, Ho Chi Minh in Venezuela, in Vietnam. I had a student once on the final exam in Latin American history say that the first country that achieved independence in Latin America was Yugoslavia. This was at the end of a semester. I think they meant Venezuela, but it had, Z sounds in it. And so there's been, and in the case of North Korea, the one man, it was even hereditary. So you had like a hereditary communist monarchy. This is a complete distortion of the original communist ideology, let alone Marx himself. And so in some ways, communist systems degenerated in the direction of populism. And the Cultural Revolution in China was a deeply polarizing thing and divided even post-revolutionary China into socialist roaders and capitalist roaders. And there was a hell of a lot of people in the capitalist roader camp who got persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, and the mobilization of people and the use of violence against opponents was dramatic.
We're going to go a little past 11:30 if that's okay. I want to get to all the questions. I know we have several more at the Friendly House, but I don't want to be ignoring our Zoom audience. I'll paraphrase a question from Hank Robb. He asks, how would you classify Theodore Roosevelt as a progressive or a populist? And on the other side of the spectrum, Ronald Reagan. How would you classify those two?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt was, of course, a progressive, and he came to power right at the tail end of the populist movement. And the president that he took over from when McKinley was assassinated had run against William Jennings Bryan. And so, I mean, one of the interesting things about Roosevelt, although he was in many ways pro-business and a traditional Republican of the time, he was a progressive. He supported the income tax. He supported direct election of senators. He railed against monopolies and trusts. And so I don't think he would have been doing those things if the populist movement hadn't shown the power of that and what large support there was for going after privilege. And so there are populist qualities to Theodore Roosevelt's rhetoric. There's an important conservative thinker that I've mentioned in here before named Peter Viereck, sort of faded from prominence, but he was prominent in the late 40s and early 50s, who told conservatives that they should be preserving the main institutions of the New Deal because they had become solid institutions of America. And so conservatives should be trying to conserve them. But he did object to what he called the populist style of Franklin Roosevelt and ways in which he demonized the rich and demonized corporations and so forth. And if you go back and look at Franklin Roosevelt's rhetoric, it's often well to the left of Bernie Sanders. Ronald Reagan is an interesting character. Ronald Reagan was a fervent Democrat until he became head of the Screen Actors Guild in California and had run-ins with communists, and then he got hooked up with general election and became this right-wing libertarian kind of guy. Look it up. There's a recording of Ronald Reagan giving a speech for Harry Truman in the election of 1948. That's just a rant against corporations and the rich and the privileged and in favor of the common man and so forth. He was, but something I didn't mention, there's a populist strand all through American politics where we are always looking for the outsider. It's an advantage to be able to claim that you're an outsider. The Democrats have been especially prone this way. McGovern was an outsider. Carter was an outsider. Clinton was an outsider. Obama was an outsider, challenging the old party elites. And I think Goldwater and Reagan fit that in the Republican Party, so that Reagan was presenting himself not as a typical politician, but as this former actor, this celebrity. He was a politician. He was governor of California for 2 terms, but even there, he tried to conduct himself as a non-traditional politician. And so when he comes to the presidency, he's railing against the institutions of the federal government. Says, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 words. The most scary 8 words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And so he ran in a kind of neo-libertarian way against public institutions. And libertarianism in that sense has a vague populist flavor to it. And Trump, of course, is the ultimate outsider. I'm not a politician, I'm a wealthy businessman, I'm a celebrity. I know I'm from the elite, I'm from the corrupt elite, but that's because why I can fix it, because I know from the inside how it works. So elect a repentant elitist. doesn't seem to be very repentant, but that's what his pitch is.
3 questions left at the friendly house. Let's go to Roy at the mic.
Okay, I have a quick 97 questions here. World cultures are obviously evolving. Will they face up to the existential crisis of climate change?
Trump won't. Bolsonaro won't. I'm not sure where Orban is on global climate change. I doubt that but Trump, if Trump is elected, and the United States is the most powerful actor in the world. If Trump gets elected, there will be 4 years in which no major initiatives on climate change will be forthcoming from the United States, and therefore probably not in the world. It's one of the horrific prospects of a Trump presidency. And it's not just him. I mean, there's a backlash in Europe against governments that are trying to promote green-friendly things by raising gas taxes. There was this huge protest movement in France when Macron tried to raise gas taxes, the yellow vest thing. There's a big backlash in Britain against green policies. There, the conservatives were actually Boris, what's his name? Yeah, Boris Johnson was kind of a green conservative, but not these days. And so people don't want to suffer current pain for what seem like kind of vague, abstract future benefits. Now, all these heat waves and forest fires across Europe and all the weird weather in the United States and the forth, that's sort of bringing people around to the notion that, hey, global warming isn't a conspiracy of the elite to get us to bend to their will. This is really happening, and maybe we ought to do something. But I think what's going to tend to happen is conservatives are going to push adaptation to climate change as opposed to prevention.
Let's go to Richard at the mic.
Hello, there was a recent article on the online publication Vox on whether Trump was a fascist. And they had 8 different experts sort of discussing various minutiae around fascism and whether Trump qualified for to be one or not. I was curious at your opinion whether you think that.
Well, interesting. The first major group to call Trump a fascist was in 2016 when he was first running. And conservatives from National Review and elsewhere were saying, this guy is a fascist. This is not a conservative. This guy is a fascist. I mean, the left had sort of gotten worn out calling George Bush a fascist. And so, it wasn't as, but there was conservatives who were calling him a fascist. I think he's got a lot of elements. He doesn't have brown shirts, but he's got the Proud Boys and he's got militias and he's got Ku Klux Klan groups and neo-Nazi groups that he winks at, and who are doing, I mean, he's got the violent intimidation of opponents, all this stuff of just swamping public officials and judges and prosecutors with a wave of death threats and death threats against their kids and so forth. I mean, this is fascistic. And so fascism comes in lots of different forms, and not all of them were as violent as Nazi Germany. I mean, there's sort of Franco-esque neo-fascism, Salazar in Portugal, neo-fascism. There's a wonderful book called The Plot Against America. Any of you heard of this? It also made it into a wonderful TV series. It's by Philip Roth, and the premise is that in 1940, when FDR is running for re-election, and the Republicans are struggling to come up with a candidate, they eventually nominate Wendell Willkie, but he sort of comes out of nowhere. Out of nowhere, flying into the deadlocked Republican convention, dressed in his pilot's costume, is Charles Lindbergh. And he gives a rip-roaring isolationist speech and an anti-FDR speech, and he sweeps the convention, gets nominated for president, and beats FDR in the 1940 election and becomes president. He makes Ford, what's Ford's first name? Henry Ford, his Secretary of Commerce, I guess. And Henry Ford was a notorious anti-Semite. He makes a peace treaty with Hitler so that America can stay out of the war. And then he gradually starts implementing anti-Semitic things. But it's all in the framework of Americanism and this great American hero doing it. It's a really chilling port. It's a great book. It was made into a TV series that had like 6 or 8 parts that's brilliantly done. The Plot Against America, I believe is the title. And so, you know, Trump's not going to look like Hitler. He's not going to grow a mustache. He's not going to go bald like Mussolini. If he develops but I think he will develop a neo-fascist kind of regime if he's elected, but it'll be an American fascism. If that's any consolation.
Our final questioner of the morning at the mic is Preston.
Oh, the German Bund in the 30s, that was a pro-Nazi group, mostly of German immigrants. They had a big rally in Madison Square Garden, and they had big American flags and a picture of George Washington, a picture of Adolf Hitler, and you're saying, you know, Nazism is 20th century Americanism. The Communist Party did the same kind of thing, actually, also in Madison Square Garden.
Preston, go ahead.
I'm curious what you think of technology. Has social media been a factor in all of this?
Yes, you know, going back to that final quote about how maybe we don't really want democracy is best when not everyone can be heard all the time. Before social media, everyone wasn't heard all the time. And so it was hard for racists and neo-Nazis and so forth to organize because they were such a small minority, and it was hard to find all their fellow fascist sympathizers. Now it's not hard. You know, you could put up a website and you can get people together when there may be only 3,000 people in the country who believe in a particular set of crap. And suddenly they've got a network and they've got organizations and they're having conventions and they're showing up at school board meetings and they're threatening people. I think QAnon is absolutely inconceivable without social media. You know, could not have had, back in the 60s, we had the John Birch Society. But it was tiny and it was marginalized, and mainstream political parties marginalized it. Today, the Republican Party is normalizing all this crap, which combined with the ease of organizing people through social media becomes very dangerous. And the other thing that social media has done and cable TV has done is fragment the audience for news and information. Used to be, if you wanted to know what was going on in the country, you had 3 choices. You had ABC, NBC, and CBS. And you had your local newspaper and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times. And as a student radical in the 60s, we used to rail against the establishment liberal domination of the media. But it created a relatively uniform base of information for the public. And so Daniel Moynihan's comment made sense that you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own set of facts. Today, you can have your own set of facts. And that makes it really hard to penetrate these silos. And so that makes polarization deeper and I think longer lasting.
Jeff, you have been so much to our organization over the years and decades. Thank you so much for this morning and for everything you've done for us. You are family here, and we really appreciate your time today as well as through the decades for us. You always make us smarter.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy coming here. I'm scheduled for one more in this series at the at the beginning of May. Non-utopian reform. And then I'm going to Uruguay, but I've agreed a couple of weeks before I leave for Uruguay to come back and give you a lecture on why I'm moving to Uruguay. And why you should too, if you have any sense. So start learning Spanish.
Well, I would love to. I'm a little concerned about that. Well, let me just ask you this. How are the wheelchair ramps in Uruguay?
Oh, it's bad. I don't know about the ramp situation. The sidewalks in Montevideo are terrible. They're all, trees have uprooted segments, and so they're tricky to walk on. I think if you're in a wheelchair, you'd have to just about use the streets to get around, or use taxis.
Okay, well, I will be monitoring.
Sorry about that.
I'll be monitoring the wheelchair access there in Uruguay, and
Okay.
when it's safe, I can make the move there. When is your scheduled move there, Jeff?
Middle of August. I saw a poll, though, Latino Barometer, which does public opinion throughout Latin America, did a poll on religious beliefs of populations. And in Uruguay, it was something like 37% of the population now say they're Christians. 43% of the population say they're atheists, agnostics, or have no religion. And then there's like 3 or 4% that say they're adepts of some other religion. But the atheists, agnostics, and non-religion folks are now 5 or 6 points ahead of the Christians. And the number of Catholics that I recall has slightly increased in the last year or two. The number of evangelical Christians, which was never large in Uruguay, has actually fallen.
Sounds good. Definitely sounds like a place where we would be comfortable.
Yes.